Hello and welcome to the NovaTime Technical Library. In today's video, we're going to talk about the different meal options available to you in the NovaTime system. In prior videos, we've talked about the different types of shifts: fixed, flexible, and dynamic. However, the meal component is standard across all three types of shifts. We'll focus on the hours worked meal option today. The first thing the system has to know is if an employee is going to clock out for lunch, when to consider that clock out or off clock time a meal punch. So it's important for us to set thresholds, low and high, of when the system will recognize that as a meal punch or that they're just off clock. The other option that we want to talk about is whether or not we're going to automatically deduct lunches even though the employee is not clocking. With this option checked, that's exactly what's going to happen. So if an employee clocks in and out at the beginning and the end of the day, the system will automatically look at the meal reference table to determine what deduction should happen for that time period. Other questions that will be asked at the time of setup will be, do you want your employees to punch? If you do want your employees to punch, there's a couple of options that we have to think about. What happens if an employee punches out shorter than the defined meal window? And what happens if they clock out longer than the defined meal window? If they clock out shorter than the meal window, we're going to ask questions: do you want to deduct the full meal window or just the time that they were off clock? If you want to deduct just the time that they were off clock, we'll check the disable minimum meal deduction and actually calculate the time that they were off clock. If this is not checked, it's going to take the full 30 minutes in this case, even though they might have only been gone 25. For punches longer than 30 minutes, there's ways that we can actually roll back the time to 30 minutes, but in general our system will automatically just take the time that they were off clock. For example, if they clocked out for a 38-minute meal, we'll generally take out 38 minutes because the employee truly wasn't working for that time. If you want to roll that back to 30 minutes, please contact your system consultant or implementation engineer. The next thing we're going to talk about is the meal reference table. While this is pretty self-explanatory, it's important to understand the flow of this table. We've broken up into multiple meal periods that may be eligible in your environment. Generally, most companies will just have one meal eligibility rule. However, those that run longer shifts, maybe manufacturing, 24/7 operations, may have multiple meal levels. In this example, we're going to talk about if the employee works over 5 hours, the system's going to say that they're eligible for 30 minutes. Okay, so combined with the options up top, this is how the system will determine what to do with a meal. If they've punched and it's fallen in between the low threshold and high threshold for a meal punch out time, the system will then compare it to the meal reference table to see if they've taken a full meal. If they do not punch and this box is checked, the system will automatically deduct 30 minutes from the daily total. One option that's important to think about when using the meal reference table is the always use scheduled meals. What this will do is, if you allow schedule overrides in your company, either through the free-form schedules or template schedules, a manager may have the ability to say, this particular shift or this particular day, I don't want the employee to take a meal because we're going to maybe work a shorter shift. So if they indicate a 0-minute meal period within the schedule, that can actually override what's set up here in the meal reference table. So it's a good way for managers to be able to override for specific days if the need is needed. So we've talked about two types of meal deduction. If an employee punches by using the low and high threshold meal definition window, as well as the automatically deduct. We're going to wrap up today's video just talking about a couple of advanced options. Further information can be found on these options by talking with your system implementation consultant or support engineer. The create meal deduction X hours after punching in can be a useful feature within the NovaTime system. The features that we've talked about today is generally a punch in and punch out, maybe a single pair of punches throughout the day. If your employees move throughout jobs or departments in a given day, you might have multiple sets of punches throughout a given day. Example, maybe 8 to 12 they're working in Department 1, 12 to 2 they'll be Department 2, and so on. In this case, you want to have the meal deduction created at a specific point in time so that the meal deduction just doesn't come out of the employee's home or default department. So by clicking on this option, you can say create a meal deduction X hours, in this case 5 hours to stay consistent with our meal reference table, after punching in. If you check this option, do not split punch, it'll actually just create the reference a lot like the auto deduct meal. If you leave this unchecked, what it will do is it'll actually put in an out punch for lunch and an in punch from lunch into the timesheet system generated so that you can see the meal window. And then we have a couple options based on first in punch, or we can wait till the out punch actually happens and count backwards to where the 5 hour mark occurred. So just a couple of different ways to approach it, but most common is based on the first in punch. And lastly, based on working hours. So if you have multiple pay codes used throughout the day, so maybe work hours, training, PTO, etc., we can say only look at those codes that are configured as working hours. Lastly, we have some additional elements up here that we can control meals by. We did not go into this video, but again, if you need information about these, please contact your system engineer or implementation consultant. So the time period, we can actually define in your environment if they've started between a certain time and stopped in a certain time, deduct a defined number of minutes for meal. This is very specific to maybe manufacturing environments, public safety, etc. Shift period. So this is actually used in conjunction with dynamic shifts. So you can set up your dynamic shifts, and depending on when the system says they worked, it can deduct the meal period accordingly. If you pay or reimburse for meals, you can actually reimburse based on hours worked or by specific time windows. Again, if you need more options or more information on these options, please contact your support team. Thanks for watching today's video. While we've shown you a lot of ways to control meals in your environment, these are just tools, and it's best to check with a labor attorney to make sure that the compliance fits the needs within your specific environment. Thank you again.